52 years ago this week, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, which called for equal pay for women in the workplace. So everything is fine, right? Well, perhaps not. In fact, far from fine. As we know from the statistics now, women are significantly underpaid. Even when you correct for all other factors, they continue half a century later to be significantly underpaid for the work they do. At the beginning of his first term, President Obama signed the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which gives women more time to sue for equal pay. So everything is fine, right? No, not exactly. Here to help us sort out why we are still struggling so hard for equal pay for women more than half a century after the Equal Pay Act was passed is Lisa Maatz. Lisa is the policy advisor for the American Association of University Women, an association with a long and distinguished past in this area. She also works with the National Coalition for Women and Girls in Education and with the Paycheck Fairness Act Coalition on this issue, and she's going to help us sort it out. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
So listen, the Equal Pay Act, from everything I understand, which was passed 52 years ago in 1963, it seemed to have the right idea. It seemed to call for equal pay for women in the workplace. In its research to pass it, Congress understood that this would be a good thing for the economy, good thing for workforce, and the right thing to do. So why are we still struggling so many years later?
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of what's going on, obviously, is that this law passed so long ago, has actually been litigated so much that there's been changes made, not changes that Congress has made, but essentially in legal opinion. And so as a result, we've created a lot of loopholes, just simply going through and using the law. And the loopholes, quite frankly, are big enough to drive a Mack truck through. So at the end of the day, while we've seen absolutely some improvement in terms of equal pay for equal work, we're still not there yet. And part of the problem is because there are some clear loopholes that really need to be updated. This particular law, if you think about it, was passed before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, kind of the key civil rights acts of the day. And so it doesn't quite have the same kind of oomph and doesn't use the same kinds of tactics. So in some respects, we're updating it, and in other ways, we're trying to make it more like those more successful bills.
And you're absolutely right, by the way, that society was very different then. I saw a clip recently of President Kennedy discussing the commission he put together on women's issues, and he said, in the workplace, and he said, but of course we want to make sure that this doesn't interfere with their primary role, which is in the home. So this law was passed at a different time, and as you say, I guess there have been a lot of very sympathetic rulings, sympathetic to employers, I should say. So what are some of those loopholes that we need to address?
Yeah, well, one of the big ones has to do with being able to talk about your wages at work. Even though we already have a bill named for Lilly Ledbetter, I like to call this part of the Paycheck Fairness Act the Ledbetter provision, because it essentially says that you can talk about your wages at work and share it with your colleagues if you'd like, inquire about wage practices of your HR department, and not get fired for it. Now, that may sound like a reasonable free speech issue, but right now about half the people in the country work at places where it's legal for them to be fired. And in fact, that's what happened with Lilly Ledbetter, where she was told, nope, you can't talk about that at work, and if you do, you'll be fired. And it's part of the reason why it took her 19 years to figure out what was going on. So we know if we can have transparency without retaliation, that it really helps to close the wage gap. So that's a very key element of what the Paycheck Fairness Act does.
We're talking with Lisa Maatz, who is Chief Policy Advisor for the American Association for University Women. And for those who don't know the details of the case, Lilly Ledbetter was a 19-year employee of Goodyear, as I recall and understand it. And it wasn't until, as you say, Lisa, until she finally brought the issue up that she realized she was making $13,000 less per year than her male peers. She was fired for it, and then basically her case was thrown out on a technicality of time to filing. And this is my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, and so the Lilly Ledbetter Act corrects that technicality and makes it possible for women to sue on a longer time frame. But we need a law that will make it possible to discuss these issues and find the disparities, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have to be able to talk about it. And at Goodyear, she was told that she wasn't allowed to. Actually, the way she found out about it was an anonymous note stuck in her mailbox that showed that she was not only being paid less than her male counterparts, but less than the guys who were more junior to her, in fact, the ones that she had trained. The irony of all that, of course, is that we still don't know who sent her that note, because under current law, Goodyear could still fire that person. So it's kind of like the deep throat of equal pay. We don't know who this person is, and at the end of the day, it would be very interesting to find out, but right now they can't reveal themselves.
It is fascinating. You would think that what I'm getting paid should be my information to reveal or not reveal as I so choose, and the same should be true of my colleagues in the workplace, not that it's the employers to protect as they see fit, particularly in this case when that amounts to concealing a pattern of what might be illegal behavior. So it's a striking fact. What are some of the other things we need to correct in the workplace for women?
Well, just real quickly, I will mention that that's part of the reason why union contracts can be so helpful for women, and why we see the lowest kind of equal pay for equal work gap in union contracts, because it is all public, right? So we know what's going on there. In terms of the Paycheck Fairness Act, we also are looking at things like dealing with who you would compare your salary to, which I know sounds very basic, but according to current law and the way it's kind of shook out as it's been litigated, you actually have to have somebody in your physical workplace who's doing the same job to compare yourself to. Now, if you think about it, if we take, say, like a Walmart, you might be the only jewelry department manager they have. Now, might be a Walmart 10 miles down the street that you could compare yourself to, but according to the Equal Pay Act and the way it's been litigated, immediately, because there is no other jewelry department manager in that store, you are already out of luck and cannot do a comparison in terms of your wages. So we're saying, wait, you should be able to compare within a reasonable geographic subdivision. You know, we're not going to compare Portland to New York City, but within a reasonable geographic subdivision, you should be able to find other comparators in order to make your case.
And economists have gotten that one down. I mean, we know in the economics profession, it's well understood how to compare wages, what those geographic and demographic groupings are. So that's not, perhaps they didn't know as well 52 years ago, but we certainly know now. So that's reasonable. So the Paycheck Fairness Act is really the next step in attempting to get pay equity for women in the workplace. So one of its provisions is the ability to share this information. Another has to do with the comparing of wages in a more reasonable way than is currently allowed based on rulings. What are some of the other provisions of the Paycheck?
Well, you know, we also beef up essentially the deterrent. One of the things that any woman will tell you, and Lily would tell you as well, she's much on my mind because we have our national convention next week in San Diego, and she's joining us. But one of the things that any woman would tell you is that they'd rather just get paid fairly than have to go to the problem of a lawsuit. A lawsuit is draining, it's expensive, it's emotionally exhausting. So part of what we want is an actual deterrent within the law instead of the current caps that we have right now, so that employers will pay attention. Employers will look at that and say, you know what, it's in my best interest to make sure my house is in order, follow the law now, rather than just wait to see if I get caught later. Because right now, fines and the kind of back pay that they're responsible for are very minimal. So it just becomes the cost of doing business rather than the deterrent we'd like it to be.
So that's which is an excellent idea. Again, we are talking to Lisa Maatz of the American Association of University Women about the Paycheck Fairness Act and completing the work begun 52 years ago. Now, here's something that I wanted to ask you a little bit, Lisa, about the politics of fighting to get something like the Paycheck Fairness Act passed. One of the things that I'm old enough to remember the 1970s when the Equal Rights Amendment was being discussed and voted on in a number of states. And one of the things that struck me about the politics of then versus the politics of now is that, for example, you had a lot of Republican supporters of and I know you're a nonpartisan, I'm not trying to be partisan, but just in terms of getting this law passed, back in the 70s, you had a lot of Republican supporters, including President Gerald Ford, of the Equal Rights Amendment. It seems now as if there is more of a partisan split on the issue of equity for women. Is my perception off there? What's the path to victory for something like the Paycheck Fairness Act today?
Well, no, I don't think your perception is off, but I will say the situation is evolving. I mean, certainly our friends in, our pro-business allies, and we're, of course, actually very pro-business, because without business, people don't have jobs and don't have wages. But sometimes they think that this is somehow going to, like any other civil rights provision, end the world. Whether it was the Family Medical Leave Act or anti-racial discrimination issues and affirmative action or equal pay, they always start, crying Chicken Little is going to die and the sky is going to fall and everything is going to end. And, of course, it never does. So part of what we're trying to get them to understand is that this is good for business, because when people are paid fairly, they're much better employees. They're also, quite frankly, going to have the money to buy the very products that you're producing or trying to sell.
Right,
and so in that sense, it's huge. Where I see the evolution, I'll tell you, is that, we have a lot of Democratic friends who very much get this issue. A lot of our Republican friends have been slower to come to the table, although the Equal Pay Act itself, 52 years ago, was very bipartisan.
Right.
Two actual AEW members who were members of Congress at the time were responsible for writing it. So part of what we're doing now is that we are finding more of our Republican friends are at least willing to admit to the fact that there's a pay gap. Quite frankly, 5 years ago, it was hard to find Republican friends who were saying, yes, indeed, there's a pay gap and we should do something about it. Now, even though they've made that admission, they're understanding that part of it a little bit better. Some of the solutions they're putting forward aren't things we really think are going to work too well, but, I'm choosing to look at it as a cup half full kind of situation, because getting them to the point where they understand, in fact, there is a pay gap, that it's not myth, it's just math, and at the end of the day, we need to take care of it, is, I think, quite a victory, quite frankly.
Well, I think it is absolutely progress, and I also think they are going to come to realize, we've had Terry O'Neill from the National Organization for Women on the show many times, and Terry has pointed out that men now are very much, across demographic segments, are very much in support of this, because most households are two-earner households, and they recognize that a pay increase for their wives is good for the whole family. So this is, I suspect that some of our Republican friends may quickly discover that this is not only good policy, it is good politics.
Yeah, it's good politics, it's good policy, it's good economics, quite frankly. If you want a good economic stimulus, pay women fairly, and that makes a huge difference. I do want to make a distinction, though, between our elected Republican officials, who haven't always been helpful on this issue, versus, the everyday man on the street Republican and Democratic folks. This is really a bipartisan issue. 80% of folks believe there's a gap and we should do something about it. And as you said, a lot of men do, too, because they look at the paycheck of their wives, many instances even more now, where they're doing the same job as their wife, and they see that she's getting paid less and can't figure out why. We've actually had people come and testify to that effect. It's not just simple fairness. It's not just a moral issue. It literally is an economic issue as well. And if we want a country that's competitive, we need to make sure we're paying fairly.
Just one of the many issues for women where the right thing to do is also the right thing to do. And we're going to have to leave it there. But Lisa Maatz, policy advisor for the American Association of University Women, thank you for bringing us up to date on this 52-year struggle and counting.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. And we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.